Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. May His peace and blessings be upon our Holy Prophet and his progeny. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of The Convertsation, the TV program that discusses the issues, struggles, and daily challenges of converts to the religion of Islam. Thank you for joining me, Daniel Pizer, and my co-host, Shaykh Yahya Seymour, for another episode as we discuss the subject of InfoWars. Where does a new Muslim go for information? What are the appropriate sources for information on issues of doctrine and practice? And what sources should be avoided? What are some common roadblocks and areas that new Muslims get hung up? Often a trickle of new information can turn into a flood. How can a new Muslim deal with this without feeling completely overwhelmed? As I said, joining me is my co-host, Shaykh Yahya Seymour. When we were on our last episode, we were talking about the fact that we had some mail, some requests for different issues that we talk about that we needed to get to. I thought this would be a good subject because one of those messages from a sister on Facebook said that when she looked back, she says, putting myself in the shoes of when I was more newly converted, that it was hard to learn and hard to know who to trust. And that there's a lot of conflicting sources of information. That when you first start out, it can be hard to find any information, on the other hand. And that apart from that, a lot of times people help you until you convert. And as we discussed in the previous episode, once you convert, sometimes a lot of interest and support evaporates. So, using this as the lead-in, and I'm sure we'll come back to this throughout the response, the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the first problem she raises, which is that there's, at the beginning, it can seem difficult to find any information that you need. And this is in a broad sense, I think, just in terms of what are the correct doctrines and practices. And then after that, how do we distinguish what are correct sources of guidance on that align with the correct belief and practice of the infallible Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala al-Tahirin. Thank you again, Shaykh Daniel, for presenting the crucial topic at hand. And I do believe it is a very crucial one. More importantly, I believe that specifically it's one which affects many, many people, because unlike, say for example, the more Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad. I tried my best to think of a way to gloss over the reality, but unfortunately I'm just going to have to say it as it is, because we're talking about people's futures here, we're talking about the akhir of these converts, and we just have to say facts as they are. As we know, Islam is divided, according to mainstream perception, into two camps, Sunni and Shia. And as a result of that, as a result of the Sunnah being the majority, who have a lot more of their works translated, who have the dominant voice on the internet, for statistically they are at least 80% of the so-called Muslim world, we face the inevitable reality that they are those who have a dominance in terms of the intellectual information propaganda war, if you would call it that. Sure. And so as a result, the new convert, even if they consciously make the decision to become Shi'i, is sometimes misinformed. And when he's told things like, or she is told things like, there's no real difference between us, you can't blame such a person for thinking, well, surely I can return to a general hadith book then. And so as a result, I do appreciate fully the situation that these converts find themselves in. Are they to trust the books of history that, for example, say that, you know, the Imams did X, Y, and Z? For example, are they to trust the narrations in which Ibn Abbas is reported to have said about Imam Ali alayhi salam that he burnt people alive? And this was a crime? Are they to trust sources that say, for example, Imam Ali alayhi salam went and tried to propose to the daughter of Abu Jahl? Or are we to trust the sources which say that no, these people are immaculate individuals? And it really is a difficult balance to strike for the new convert who is unaware of what sources to trust. I mean, I speak from personal experience here. When you were told things like, we don't have any authentic books, we just look at what contradicts the Quran and what does not contradict the Quran, whilst this is what the Imams have told us to do, it's a sound principle. But if that's the case, why don't I just stick to the Quran? You know what I mean? It's going to be the safer route to take. And more importantly, by putting this into the mind of a convert, you're actually souring their aqidah even further, because this poor convert is going to be dependent upon translations. Translations most often go for the literal Arabic translation of what the Quran says. So for example, when it comes to Surah Al-Fath, إِنَّ فَتَحْنَا لَكُمْ فَتْحًا مُبِينًا. The rest of the verse, according to most English translations, says, so that Allah might forgive your sins of what preceded and what is to come. Now, the poor convert to Shiism is going to be thinking, what? I've been taught that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi is infallible. And yet the Quran here, according to this English translation I have, is now saying that he sinned. So it's a dangerous game, because when it comes to the Quran, we don't believe, as some people do, that you take the most appropriate linguistic definition, that the Quran somehow explains itself, that we go for tafsir of the Quran by the most obvious meanings within the Quran.
Sure.
We believe that we go back to those people upon whom the Quran was revealed to, the household of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as they say, no knowledge which comes from out with this house will avail or cause people salvation. And so we need to be extremely diligent. Another case study I think I might add here is some things are attributed to Ahlul Bayt and do not actually emanate from Ahlul Bayt. So for example, a very popular work in the English language, Lantern of the Path, very popularly attributed to Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. And people will say, oh, this nice akhlaqi treatise from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, in which you will find contradictions with what the Imam has been known to teach in other narrations. So for example, when he says that Hassan al-Basri is the Samari of this ummah, the one who deviated this ummah, and then you go back to the book Lantern of the Path and you find him praising Hassan al-Basri. Or you find him praising Sufyan al-Fawri, who again is another enemy of the Ahlul Bayt, according to what the Ahlul Bayt have said in their authentic narrations. So what do? I believe the most appropriate strategy here for the convert who struggles and is unsure as to what to rely upon is to constantly refer back to the ulama, refer back to the resident alims of their centers, ask them, sit down with them, say, Shaykhana, can you recommend a particular book for me? Yes. Can you recommend a particular work? General piece of advice, when it comes to akhlaq works, as long as they're not going into theology and history, when it comes to just basic akhlaq, you can't really go wrong with depending on something as long as it's demonstratively from the Shi'i community. Yeah. And when I say that, I mean you wouldn't want to be picking up akhlaq from, with due respect, some of the companions of the Prophet who didn't necessarily go around carrying out the best of akhlaq. Yeah. So it's a dangerous path. You wouldn't want to pick up how to be a good wife from, say for example, one of the wives of the Prophet who's condemned in the Quran. I'm sorry, but we have to just speak facts as they are, Shaykh. And I know it's a very sensitive topic, but it's a crucial one, and we wish to preserve
I think some of them,
sanity of our community.
There's issues with sensitive topics within the Muslim community that for converts are not necessarily sensitive topics. Absolutely. Because they don't come in necessarily having sacred cows all the time.
Just define what you mean by sacred cows. We're not accusing them of being Hindus here.
No. Well, I hope not. Anyway, I can't speak for everyone, but what I'm saying here is that they may have, in every religion, there are certain figures who are very elevated, and unfortunately in some religions there are some figures that do not necessarily deserve the level of elevation they have, or any elevation whatsoever. For a convert, I think that's sometimes less of an issue. But what I want to get back to is in the initial stages, after someone's taken their shahada, what are the first places that they should be looking, the first sources they should be going to for learning things like basic usul ad-din and, say, the performance of the salat? Or
The websites of the Maraja, primarily. The websites of the Maraja and the representatives of the Maraja of the world who are recognized, are mainstream, are given legitimacy by the community, and are known to have a large following. When they refer back to these Maraja, when they refer back to their websites, they can find often books on how to pray. How to pray is going to be something universally accepted within the madhab of Tashayyu'. Even those who are viewed as slightly more controversial will agree upon the universal aspects of prayer. Particularly if you're praying within a Shi'i context, within a Shi'i masjid in your home, they'll agree upon those things. When it comes to the usul ad-din, then again, we find there's largely no difference. We find they can refer back to the websites of the ulama.
What about commonly available books that you would find
Commonly available books.
a lot of centers?
In regards to the commonly available books, then there's an abundance in the English language, and generally we find that people don't tend to lie in these books. People don't tend to include things which are controversial, especially when it comes to the usul ad-din, your imama, your resurrection, your prophethood, your adala, namely your divine justice, and your tawheed. You're not going to find people kind of deviating or bringing in extra information which is not, particularly within a book in English.
Yeah.
You're not going to find people talking about something which is not commonly accepted.
And there's some of these that are published as series in English as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm trying to remember the names of them, but I know there's one 5-volume set that covers usul ad-din. The center that I used to go to, we would give out copies of that for free to new converts, along with Risala Ahmadiyya and a small booklet on Salat. On the other hand, some of these things, unfortunately, either because of the quality of translation or other things like this, not to say anything against the translators, I'm so glad someone's translating these things. Inshallah, they'll be rewarded big time here in this life and in the next. But there are some things that are sometimes unclear in a translation. Even if we look in Risala Ahmadiyya, it may be confusing to a convert because there's certain terminology that simply doesn't translate well to English, and so frequently it'll be left, understandably, in Arabic. And there are other...
Imamate is a really good example of that.
Sure.
I mean,
well, not
if we were speaking to English people and we said, yeah, Imamate, well, what does it mean?
Exactly. Even if we look in a Risala and we see certain wordings that are a fairly literal translation of the Arabic, but that within the context of a Risala carry a slightly different meaning. For instance, if it says that you should avoid a certain thing. This means typically in the context of a Risala that you don't just do your best to not go near it, but if you do, it's, no harm,
absolutely.
no foul, as opposed to being the sort of urfi, the cultural definition. In English, when we say, oh, I avoid that type of thing, doesn't mean if I say I avoid a certain type of food, doesn't mean I never eat it.
Of course not. Of course not.
Or even if you, the rules of fasting, for instance. Fasting while traveling, it will say something like that you may not pray, or that the full prayer isn't obligatory on you. Fasting is not obligatory on you either. Right? Someone may interpret that to mean...
So I'm still allowed to.
I'm allowed to do it.
It's just a matter of choice.
Right. So even within the Risala, you may find that there's, for new Muslims, some kind of confusion in them. So I think even in that context, I agree that this is... Risala is maybe one of the first places that you should go. Any Risala. For the most part,
I do think it's important to sit down with the Ahl al-Ilm on this issue.
That's what I was going to say.
Alims.
Having someone teach you the Risala is going to be much more beneficial.
Now, the problem is if you don't have access to one. Something that happened to me, for example. I lived in a very small city in Scotland where I didn't initially have access to resident alims. There was no Shi'i scholars living in my city.
It's an increasingly common problem because of the internet.
Because of the digital age. And the problem is resident alim becomes replaced with Shaykh Google.
Ayatollah
and
Google.
Shaykh Google, unfortunately, is probably the most deviant sheikh out there, who's leading all sorts of people to hellfire right now as we speak. But realistically, I think that this issue could be remedied, and my advice to those converts who find themselves in a situation in which they have no recourse, no access to a resident alim, either due to the proximity of their location from the nearest center or due to their center not having an alim within it, is to perhaps get in contact with other centers that are prominent within the country, particularly one of the bigger ones where you're more likely to get a response. And even to do your best. I mean, there's enough online communities these days where you could request, if anybody knows the name of a sheikh or knows any sheikhs living in the vicinity in the country, if they could perhaps get their phone numbers and call them about any inquiries they have. Ideally, they'd be able to take lessons from them on Pal Talk or something like that, just for basic questions they have, or even Skype, or one of the numerous means that they can do so today. However, just very basic level, phone number, I think is a very simple solution.
Also, of course, if any viewers have questions, they can always email us at the program, converts at Imam Hussein 3.TV, and inshallah, if we can't answer the question on the program, we can always email them back and point them to more specific resources as well.
Well, I was kind of hoping that this show would not be diverted from the main issue, which
I don't mean, necessarily
social
to
issues
discuss
converts face, to an istifta'at show, but we'll be more than willing to respond via email.
Yes, that's what I mean, inshallah. I think that we're going to go to break now, and inshallah after that, we'll come back and go over another viewer response that we had via Facebook and discuss that. Inshallah. In the meantime, our information for contacting the conversation will be posted on the screen. Joining us again, and welcome back to the conversation. I'm Daniel Pizer. With me, as always, my co-host and friend Sheikh Yahya Seymour, and we were discussing some write-in questions that we had for the program. The general theme of the show, we were talking about proper sources of information. Inshallah, we can be one of those proper sources of information. One of the messages is a little long, and it covers a number of points. So we're going to break this down a little bit, and inshallah we'll be able to answer them.
Inshallah we will be able to get around to answering the full question. If not within today's show, certainly over the next few shows we do.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of points where we may have to sort of gloss over them briefly, and then come back to them in longer episodes that, that will address the issues. So, one sister said there's a number of different points that she would like discussed on a show for converts. The first one, she said, is marriage issues, which we are going to devote separate episodes to.
We'll need to.
But I'll read through the comment just the same, because I think it's important for viewers who are not converts to hear this, because this
ones
first
who are
point,
converts and fail to understand why some other converts wish to make a big deal out of being a convert and just can't get on with being a normal Muslim.
Yeah. This first point is important for communities to hear, sadly, because I've heard it repeated in other comments that we've received or elsewhere online.
Sure.
The first thing dealing with marriage issues, she said, is that when you go to speak to potential in-laws for marriage, that she was sort of treated or implied that she was promiscuous or had a promiscuous background.
I see.
And I've seen other comments saying the same thing, that at first they thought that it was just them, but then when they see other people making the same comment, that they see maybe this is a trend. I think the assumption maybe for some families that because someone comes from a background of being a convert, that they didn't necessarily have any morals, apparently, before that. So I don't know if we want to touch on that now or just save that for the...
I don't mind dedicating, 5-10 minutes to this just particular point, and we can move on to the next one, inshallah. Because I do think it is important, and I would feel I would sort of feel as if we've let the sister down, that if we would quote that and not kind of do justice to the statement. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala tahirin. I think the first thing that needs to be borne into account, or borne in mind, so to speak, when we think of such issues, is the fact that naturally, whilst converts do encounter these issues with marriage, there's naturally a gender dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's unfair for me to claim that I understand this situation that sisters have to go through. I know particularly sisters who are from more kind of European or Anglo-American backgrounds will face the accusation of being promiscuous prior to marriage a lot more easily. I can only speak from my experience, and from my experience when I went to propose to my wife's family, who are of course traditional Muslims from a traditional Shia country. I was met with relatively good support, and I mean, I was met by my immediate in-laws, my mother and father-in-law, with the right attitudes, kind of a lot of support for the fact I was a convert, a lot of understanding, and they have traditionally been understanding throughout my marriage as well. On my wife's extended family, however, that's where I started to get these kind of accusations, and the accusation that comes a lot more when it's a man, I tend to find, or a male convert proposing to a female, is the fact that did he convert for the sake of the girl?
Yes.
And so I didn't get that nonsense from my in-laws. Naturally, the fact that I had been studying Islamic studies at university and had been able to bring a letter of reference from a prominent Shiite scholar in the UK was in my favor. However,
that's going, really, what's the word I'm looking for? Going above and beyond. For most people, they may not. That's a lot.
They might not have
to
the
ask.
opportunity to do that, right?
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, from some of my wife's extended family, I was getting all this nonsense behind my back. So was my wife. That we've got here someone that probably converted to marry her, and this is just a disgusting accusation as well, because upon the girl who's been a religiously practicing girl throughout all her life. And more importantly, if a guy wants to get into a relationship, he's not going to lock himself up into a religion. And more importantly, he's not going to end up studying that religion at university and make it as a life purpose.
Yeah.
This is really something people need to understand. But I just brought up that anecdote to show that not every culturally Muslim family is necessarily opposed to the converts.
Yep.
Now, have I heard horror stories? Absolutely. I've heard disgusting horror stories, Shaikh Daniel, which would turn your beard grey if perhaps you were to hear of them over
It's
the
already
show.
kind of going that direction now, sadly.
Over the past few weeks of receiving these emails, I'm sure, as well.
Some of them, yeah.
Yet, we do appreciate this situation, and sadly, there is a bit of a stereotype, even amongst, because I converted when I was relatively young, I have a sort of demographic knowledge of what youth my age who are culturally Muslim think of these young women who convert as well, and sadly they often view them as an opportunity to enter into.
They view them as easy, essentially.
Easy, and Ajalakum Allah, we have a particular term in the West which we use, which is loose.
Yeah.
And they view them as loose. And for those of you who are not familiar with this term, then please don't go and look it up. It's I mainly wanted to use this term for a more mature audience of people who had reached the age of where these things would be concerning them and would kind of be familiar with this discussion.
But I think the reason that we at least touch on this now, that we'll have to come back to when we have some episodes that are more fully dedicated to the issue of marriage, is to first of all make communities aware that this is a very common perception, and secondly, to say how hurtful and offensive something like that can be. Beyond that, the underlying assumption goes much further than just the woman that they formed the assumption about. It goes to society at large. Now, we may have issues in Western society, but that doesn't mean that people in it are without any morals whatsoever.
Absolutely.
Or that they're all raised awfully and that they are all going to be, criminals or promiscuous or anything else like that.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, this seems to be kind of an attitude that is not only somewhat prevalent in some indigenous Muslim communities, but seems to be tolerated, unfortunately. And I think it's good we touched on it, at least so we can say that it's not something that should be tolerated.
I would also argue that in not only is it tolerated, but you see, when the leadership of our community on a resident alim scale, I don't mean any further up the ladder, moved to the West, there was a degree of pragmatism involved in which they needed to gloss over their words because they are now living in the West and could no longer afford to condemn it from within. Especially otherwise they'd be asked the fact that, why are you here? You know,
Exactly.
these kind of questions. But from outside the West, particularly from the dominant attitudes I've heard here in Iraq, it doesn't only seem to be tolerated, rather it seems to be perpetuated from the minbar.
Yeah.
And perpetuated on a societal level, that this stereotype of Westerners being loose, Western women being raised to be entirely promiscuous,
Yeah.
seems to be dominant. And in reality, and of course I'm talking about exceptions to the rule, some of these cultural Muslims ought to have some shame, because when you look at the hijab of some of these convert sisters, it's much more appropriate to the boundaries of Islamic law
Absolutely.
than the hijab of some of the cultural Muslim extended family members of these same people who are the first to point the finger. Now, I'm not saying that people with bad hijab are to be condemned here. I'm just saying, if condemning is going to go on, do remember that if you will point the finger, others will be willing to point the finger at you. And when they do so, you might not find it too nice.
We also have a separate narration in which one of the Imams alayhi salam says that no one will accuse someone of something except that they themselves will be guilty of committing that very thing at some point in their lives.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's something for people who have fear of God and the day of judgment in the next life, it's something to be aware of.
And I take that upon myself before I say it to
Absolutely.
anyone else. Absolutely. I've experienced that in my own lifetime. I used to be someone extremely judgmental, and I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal makes us all understand that we need to work upon ourselves before working upon anyone else.
There's one issue, second one, that the same sister brings up, which we've touched on, but I'll read because, again, I think it's useful for communities to hear this. She says that you're always the revert, or convert is the preferred word we use on the program, even if you know better than someone who's born Muslim about a particular issue. And often you're treated like, she says, often you're treated like you know nothing and asked if you even know how to pray. And I can say, the sister happens to be watching, I still get asked these questions, even in a Hausa environment, so it's certainly not a foreign question to any of us, or a foreign issue. Now, someone may ask someone if they know how to pray, and you can tell if they're being sincere in terms of they want to help you, and they're not trying to be condescending, they mean very well, but there's other people where it's, do you even know how to pray? Which is a very different way of asking a question.
And I think we can accommodate a difference for your experience as a convert within the first few weeks of your converted life.
And years later.
Your experience as a convert coming to the masjid 5 years after converting.
Well, what's sad is when we see other posts online or questions written into us or other things that people saying that I've been converted for a number of years and I still have questions about my salat that haven't been answered, either because I can't get help from people or the people that I've asked for help who offered help when I first converted, that seems to sort of dry up. They don't return my phone calls anymore.
Yeah.
And something like that will get someone very close to thinking about just leaving the religion because they don't know how to practice it and no one's offering to come to their assistance.
I just want to go off into a slight tangent here, especially from some of the questions that I saw from some sisters in regards to their experience as converts. Now, some of them had pointed out on places like the questions we got sent, the comments we got sent, the thoughts we got sent, and some blogs online, I've read similar experiences. Sisters mourn that often they're faced with petty questions as well, which are asked in order to condescend them, but at the same time have no relation to Islam.
Yep.
Such as, have you learned how to cook this dish yet? Now, I'm sorry.
Really? I haven't seen that one yet.
I don't know what the relationship between your ability to cook Iraqi or Indo-Pak cuisine is and your ability to call yourself a Muslim. Now, if I'm missing the point here, maybe sisters have come to believe this. Some sisters in some parts of the world believe this is part and parcel of Islamic identity. but it certainly isn't. More importantly, I think also the kind of expectation that you get to wear certain dress codes as well is another problem that I've seen amongst converts of both genders.
Sure.
With brothers, they said that with certain communities, they felt that they were being expected to adopt, like shalwar kameez, certain communities, and other such habits like that.
I'm not sure what to say about that, except that I've seen the same thing happen. The next issue she brings up is a massive one, which we've also discussed in some prior episodes, but it's worth, again, mentioning. Third big thing she brings up is family. She says, everyone who's reading this was a thread on Facebook here knows the arguments, the insults, the digs, getting thrown out sometimes, crying, and this, she puts it very well, awkward sort of tolerance that is achieved on occasion, and the disappointment. And if you're living with your family and they're non-Muslim, also the fact that the home may be sort of surrounded or filled with haram. And that she says this one is especially painful for her. Now, for my part, I can say, at least on the last point, my family has always been a dog family. There will always be dogs in the household, and my parents come from sort of a normal, we could say, Christian Western background. So when I go home to visit them, there is dog hair everywhere. They keep wine in the house. There is pork in the refrigerator. There's, of course, limits to what we can do or say
without being perceived as being extremely disrespectful.
Exactly.
And pushing the boundaries like people.
Now that's maybe the least of the issue in some cases, but the fact that the tension that can come in families as a result of conversion is something that unfortunately I think a lot of communities lose sight of, that the convert may be going through that and don't often ask enough in a supportive way, how are things going with your family? Not have you converted them yet, but how is your relationship okay? Do you need help? This kind of thing.
You see, the first problem, the problem of how we feel with the issue of dealing with our families in the first place, the kind of stuff we have to deal with our families, is in and of itself a tragedy. To go through that and then be asked, so your family still aren't Muslim yet, why haven't you converted them, is the biggest tragedy after that. In the experience of the convert, of course, I'm not comparing any of these things to actual real tragedies which have occurred in history. Let me just say that I don't like to open up myself to go through my own personal issues way too much, but right now as you know, I'm married, I've got 2 kids, 2 daughters, may Allah preserve them and keep them on a state of health, inshallah ta'ala. One of my parents, now I don't want to go into too intrinsic detail here, but one of my parents, because of the fact that they are keen to meet my brother's fiancée this year, he's engaged and he plans to get married, of course he's still Christian, they are embarrassed by the fact that their younger son has chosen to go down this religious extremist route as they view it, and that
you're now living in Iraq. And
absolutely, and that his wife wears the hijab, and he's got these 2 kids who have completely Muslim names that can't even be recognized by Western society. And so as a result, I was politely told this year that, we're having a few issues at home, renovations are going on, so, we're not sure if you guys can come to visit. Later on, I found out that this just happens to coincide with my brother's visit with his fiancée. And so it almost feels like there's a deliberate attempt to just keep me out of public view because I'm somehow an embarrassment to my parents. Now, to have to go through that at home, along with numerous other issues. So, for example, unfortunately, just to open up things a little bit more without going into too much detail, which I don't like to do, my father still hasn't met my wife or my 2 daughters through just conveniently avoiding ever having to do that since I got married. Of course, he's spoken to my wife. He's seen photos of my 2 daughters. We still keep regularly updated. I still regularly try and keep contact with him. But he's avoided any meetings with them, or me, since the time I got married or had those 2 kids. And for me to have to go through that, which is a constant strain on me, makes me constantly feel bad. It gives me, to some degree, what I would consider I guess we could call it an emotional identity schizophrenia, in the sense that I'm not sure where my heart is. Should I feel brokenhearted about the fact that my family haven't accepted these things? Or should I just progress on with life? And when you want to progress on with your life in the religious community, you find you're being dragged from this corner, that corner, and walked on like a rug, so to speak.
Or prodded about very painful, like emotional choke points.
Prodded about very difficult questions. And when you explode, when you finally ventilate that frustration or act in a way which is perceived as out of line, it's like, what? I thought he was a good guy. You know, how long is he? He's about to be studying Islamic studies. Of course I am. But still, I have this fact that I have these parental issues at home, and so it's only natural that at times certain actions, certain ways that they treat people will come back and basically become much bigger than they should have been had people just been understanding about these issues.
In the remaining 2 minutes that we have, what I want to ask you is, do you think that it's too much for converts, or that it's not okay for them to say, be somewhat direct about this, if someone starts posing questions like this, to say that, you know, I appreciate your interest, but this is a really sensitive point, and to explain to them, to educate them a little bit, that this is actually a more difficult issue? Or do you think that for them, that maybe that would put them in a harder position to do something like that? Or what's something we could do, or communities can do briefly, that might be useful to address this?
I do think that, as you put it, since many people like to inquire into the families of converts a lot, it's a very sensitive issue, and the community does need to take into account that, look, this convert might be going through a hell of a lot that he doesn't want to speak about, she doesn't want to speak about. The convert should obviously go in the best way possible to phrase that in the most diplomatic way. What I mean by that is, they should try their best, they should endeavor to basically not be harsh in
You mean say, I appreciate your concern?
Yes, exactly.
This kind of thing.
And one way of developing a sense of empathy would be to essentially say, for example, look, brother, I do appreciate your concern, but imagine it this way. If you were having family issues at home, in your traditional family, you wouldn't want that to be opened up to the world in this sense. You might want them to appreciate you having family issues, but you might not want them to feel that they have a right to be privy to every little minute detail. Likewise, my family are still my family. I have emotional attachments to them. I care for them. And more importantly, I've got to worry about the fear of, since I believe this religion is true, and they want nothing to do with this religion, and I believe this religion is the path to salvation and Allah's pleasure and the hereafter, and we're not upon its path, there's a slightly nasty conclusion to that statement.
Yeah.
And with all these emotions in my mind, the last thing I need is for people to ask me these questions. And just let me say something very quickly before the show ends. I've had some very good friends who have, out of concern for me, asked me about my family situation. And instead of being there as a support, they think they're doing the right thing, but they might say, well, if you don't mind me saying, your parent X or parent Y sounds weird, or your brother sounds weird. And I really don't need to hear that from these people. I really don't need to have some kind of moral condemnation. I'm the one that's being affected by my family's actions. And so for you to not only be privy to this information, but to laterally judge is just problematic.
Inshallah, we'll come back to this issue in the near future. Thank you again for joining us on another episode of The Conversation. Once again, you can email us any thoughts, questions, or concerns. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.